Hello, and welcome to another episode of Conversations about Priesthood. Today's conversation will be with Bishop Roger Morris, who is the Bishop of Colchester, and really looking forward to today's conversation. And I'm now going to reveal Bishop Roger on your screen. Hello, Bishop.
Hello.
Hi, it's nice to meet you for the first time, even though it's on Zoom.
No, it's great. It's good to meet you, and I'm really excited in what you're doing with this, actually.
Thank you. Bishop, I know I started off by just very briefly, obviously explaining who you are, but I wonder whether you'd like to maybe share a bit more about yourself.
Sure. And actually, it might be helpful to do a kind of little, because it's about vocation as well, to talk about that vocational journey. So I grew up 12 miles northeast of Bristol in a little place called Chipping Sodbury. And my ambition in life growing up was to be a research chemist. That's what I wanted to do. So I duly headed off to Imperial College in London to study chemistry.
Wow.
And then actually at the end of my first year, did two things that just kind of nudged the steering wheel a bit, really. One was that I went to hear Jackie Pullinger speak. An extraordinary talk. It was a talk called Soft Hearts and Hard Feet. And she said, our problem is we often have hard hearts and soft feet. And it was a stunning talk. I remember going back to my student room with my legs shaking, just totally in awe of what I'd heard. And then I was involved with the Methodist Church as well as the Church of England at the time. And Rob Frost in the Methodist Church had these annual missions, so I went on a mission to Yorkshire, and literally went to Hull and back. Really, it was great. It was a real experience. Although people started asking me on that mission, "Have you thought of working full time for God?"
Wow.
And I was really clear. No, I hadn't, because I was going to be a research chemist. And then during my second year, there was just a kind of like a shift in orientation. Just gradually, the things that were important to me became less important, and other things took their place. And the idea of me spending the rest of my life cooped up in a laboratory with one or two other people just began to feel like a very odd thing.
Yeah.
And I was drawn into a lot of the activities of the Christian societies at the university. And so at the end of my second year, I just said to God, I will do whatever you want, as long as I know what it is. And then I had a really interesting 2 weeks. I headed back to Bristol. I was going to work at the time for the George Muller Foundation, take a year out, do some voluntary work. And so I thought I'd better sit down with my mother and just explain that, as she'd kind of largely funded my university education, she probably ought to know that I was probably going to ditch the chemistry. And so I said, well, I'm not sure I'll stay in chemistry all my life. And she said, well, why don't you take a year out and do some voluntary work? Well, I thought this conversation's going rather easier than I thought it would. But she said, you know what I see you doing, don't you? And I said, what's that? And she said, I see you becoming a vicar. Now, unheard of in my family, so this was quite a revelation. My vicar at the time was slightly eccentric, the Reverend Commander Barry Marshall Palmer for Finchley.
Oh gosh.
And so I didn't think he was the right person to talk to. So I went to have a chat to one of the Methodist ministers that I was in touch with. Didn't tell him what it was about. Knocked on his door, and he said, I know exactly why you've come, and gave him all this stuff about going into ministry. And then we went to see my grandfather. My grandfather lived in Malvern. He was appointed by C.P. Snow during the war to work at the radar research establishment in Malvern. And he ended up principal scientific officer, but he'd never been to university. So when I ended up at university studying a science degree, he was just delighted. I thought he's going to be really gutted if I leave all that behind. But then he just looked me dead in the eye in a conversation and said, you ought to go into the church. And those 3 conversations happened within 2 weeks of me saying to God, I'll do whatever you want, as long as I know what it is. So that was it. I finished my chemistry degree. I didn't work for the George Muller Foundation in the end. I did some work in Paddington, which for a little lad from Chipping Sodbury was a bit of an eye-opener. But worked for a church there for a year, then trained for 3 years in Cambridge. And then I felt a call to rural ministry. So I was a curate of 6 parishes in the Cotswolds, and then the incumbent of 9 churches in the next door benefice in the Cotswolds. Then, because mission, hugely important for me, and I'd been involved with Springboard, which at the time was the Archbishops of Canterbury's and York's initiative on evangelism. I took a job as a diocesan missioner for 5 years in Coventry Diocese. And as part of that time was acting Archdeacon of Coventry. And then the Bishop of Worcester asked me to be Archdeacon of Worcester. And then in 2014, I was made Bishop of Colchester.
Wow, it's quite a long time.
Yeah, and the other bits to pad out, I'm married. My wife is a head teacher at a secondary school. She's also a priest. So rather bizarrely, she's taken an oath of allegiance to me, which is quite fun. And we got 2 daughters. My eldest daughter is she's graduated in illustration and graphic design, but she's also been doing some teacher training and is hoping to combine the 2 in some way. And my younger daughter's training to be a vet. We got 2 dogs, and when I'm not doing all this bishoping, one of the things that I'm passionate about is music, and I run the canopy stage at the annual Greenbelt Festival.
Oh, that is fantastic. I've never been to Greenbelt, so I might come.
Never yet.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that story. I remember when I first told my parents that I wanted to go into full-time ministry, and my mum and dad just turned around and they said, "No, how are you going to pay your bills?" That was very interesting, but here I am. So yeah. One of the first questions that I always start off with is, what is your understanding of the priesthood?
Yes. Yeah, I can approach that in all sorts of ways. I mean, I still think there's something very powerful in Michael Ramsey's thing about being with God, with the people on your heart, and that whole sort of image of the ephod and the tribes, and taking that into the presence of God. And increasingly, actually, I think there's something really powerful about the ministry of intercession. So I say morning prayer sat on the sofa next to me, and I have this little box.
Ooh.
And the front part are all the clergy in my area. So I pray for them and for their household and family and so on. And then the back part are all sorts of people who, for one reason or another, have asked for prayer. And that's a significant part of what I do each morning. And actually, it's for me, a real privilege to hold these people in prayer, to be with God, with those people on my heart. So I think that is a key thing. One of the times where I think I learned a lot more about priesthood was when I was an archdeacon. And my former archdeacon in the Diocese of Gloucester, when I became an archdeacon, referred to me as a poacher turned gamekeeper.
What does that mean?
Well, in the sense that I think he was really commenting that I was the last person he imagined being an archdeacon, because I probably gave him a bit of a hard time as an archdeacon. But I also wasn't sure. I remember asking asking another archdeacon this question once, is your job something that could be done by a lay person? Does it have to be an ordained role? And I asked that because, if you're going on a church visit to talk about how they're going to replace their downpipes and guttering, it didn't feel a very priestly thing to me. But when I actually became an archdeacon, I'd say it's one of the most priestly jobs I ever did. And I realized that part of my role in that job, and actually it's something I've really held on to since as part of that priestly role, is something about prophetically practicing the presence of God. So as an archdeacon, you're on all sorts of strange committees. So I was on a kind of investments and glebe committee, and diocesan trustees meeting, and all these kind of things. And we'd be looking at properties that we owned and how we could get more money out of them and things like that.
All the fun stuff.
And it was actually quite fun. But I realized that part of my job there was to keep God front and center. That rather than just being the person who said a perfunctory prayer at the start, it was actually about asking myself throughout, where is God in this? And asking that out loud and inviting others to be part of that process. And going out to talk about guttering at a church visit, and actually realizing that you're meeting a church warden. Church wardens are, in many ways, it's the oldest form of authorized lay ministry in the church. And so meeting this person who's given themselves, or quite a lot of themselves, to this ministry, and actually encouraging them and building them up in the faith, and realizing actually this archdeacon's role can't be done by a lay person necessarily, because there is part of that priestly ministry of outwardly kind of practicing the presence of God that's really crucial.
Yes.
And then I guess the other thing I'd add, and there are all sorts of other things that one can say, but I think these are just things that strike me as possibly in addition to the kind of, the things that we might be able to draw out by talking about John Pritchard's book on priesthood, or, some of the others. For me, one of the books I recommend to people sometimes in their diaconal year, when they're looking at being ordained priest, is the novel Gilead. And actually, I preached a Maundy Thursday Chrism Mass sermon based on Gilead. And for me, there's one bit in that in particular which I think is part of our role, and that's to be someone who blesses others and blesses things. There's something about that ministry of blessing that's really important. And bizarrely, it's one of those things that I think crosses the church, non-churched kind of boundary. So I know, I was talking to a priest the other day who had some bikers turn up in their village, and they saw her and said, "Will you bless our bikes?"
Wow, I love that.
Now things like that, the blessing of homes. I have blessed all sorts of odd things in my time as a priest, and there's a real pastoral side to that blessing as well.
Yes.
I remember once the landlord of the local pub where I was curate, who became a dear friend. His wife and daughter were confirmed, and that we're still in touch, which is lovely actually. And and it was a tied house. The brewery gave him nothing, and he worked ridiculously hard. And then one day, the brewery, as a concession, said they would recarpet the pub.
Wow.
And which, frankly, was the least they could do. I mean, he was brilliant for them. It was the place in question had a number of pubs, but his was the pub that was always busy, that was always doing good trade, and that was because he ran it really well. But when he got this new carpet, he said to me, "Will you come and bless the carpet?" And so immediately, that something of this is a kind of pastoral thing as well. It's about, how do you affirm a person who is unrecognized in all the good stuff he's doing, a key community leader. And so we had, after closing time, this lovely little service of blessing the pub carpet. Now, something like that, I think there's something really exciting about that priestly ministry. And it combines some of the other aspects. It combines some of that practicing the presence of God, that actually it's saying, here is God, God is present. One of the most powerful things we say as a priest is the Lord is here, and actually, how can we say that more and more? How can we say that by not saying that, by simply pointing to the presence of God in different ways?
I just love what you said about prophetically practicing the presence of God, and that's just been going through my mind whilst you've been talking. I've been listening, obviously, but that phrase really stood out to me, and that kind of links in well with a question that I always tend to ask is, what have been some of the joys and challenges of priestly ministry?
It's all about people and God. And I think the joy is seeing people develop in their faith, the privilege of being close to people at difficult times. Also, all sorts of things like weddings, the occasional offices. We've got a slight danger in the church at the moment that, because we're reducing the number of stipendiary clergy, the availability of people for the occasional offices is actually reducing. And yet I think that's such a vital part of our ministry. And taking funerals in rural ministry, a funeral is a big deal, right. And often when I was archdeacon, and even now, I suppose, when we're putting somebody into a rural community, you kind of sound slightly morbid, but one of the best things that can happen for them is that early on in their ministry, they get a really important funeral and they do it well, because that establishes them in that community in a way that nothing else will. Right. And some of those funerals were just extraordinary, because everybody would come. If it was a farmer, the whole farming community would turn out in force.
Wow.
And they were really, really powerful. Some of them were utterly tragic. So some funerals you have are just terribly sad. I've taken funerals of suicide victims, of children, of babies who didn't, were stillborn, of people who drank themselves to death, all sorts of things like that. But still, there's something extraordinary that society, even if they don't darken the doors of a church or anything else, they say, will you come and journey with us through this really painful part of our lives? And will you offer something of the comfort of God's love and the consolation of his presence? And you think, that is an incredible privilege.
Yes.
But some of the other things, I'm kind of, I think one of the ways in which we perform the gospel, and I think our gospel hope is performative. We, you know, you should see our gospel hope in the way that we live and the way that we act. And one of the ways that it's performative, I think, is in our inclusion of others. And some of my fondest memories are of people that you would not normally find in church, but who came and got involved. And I remember one in particular who was, I mean, I still, you know, she is still somebody I pray for on a regular basis. Her mum was an alcoholic, and the house in which she was growing up with her brother and others was pretty squalid. In fact, her aunt would occasionally arrange for me to go round, because if I was going round, her mum would tidy up a bit.
Gosh.
And this lovely person sang in the church choir, and the church choir, largely because of one member of that choir, had this just amazing ministry of inclusion. And this young person would turn up. Her mother would buy her T-shirts, and they were not the T-shirts that you could normally be seen wearing in church. I mean, they would have some outrageous, disgusting thing on the T-shirt. But it was fine. You wrapped her in a cassock, you know, she sang in the choir, all was well. But one day it was her confirmation, and we had the bishop coming for that confirmation. And somebody had decided, it wasn't me, somebody had decided that members of the choir should not wear their choir robes when they're being confirmed. And I thought, this is going to be interesting.
Yes.
And I had visions of the bishop, you know, just about to lay hands on this person and looking down and seeing the T-shirt and thinking, oh, you know. And lo and behold, on the day of her confirmation, she turned up in a white linen dress. And there was just something amazing about the way that this church held these people.
Yes.
Because it would have been, you know, there could be sometimes, and I think in later times, well after I'd left, yeah, other people found that the cost of trying to hold on to people who could be a bit disruptive sometimes and a bit difficult, meant that actually they began to feel less and less welcome.
Right.
Because you have to work at inclusion, you really have to work at it, and I regret that, but I'm really, really keen that actually this is what we do. You know, in the Diocese of Coventry, a friend of mine had an amazing ministry among Goths.
Oh, Goths! Wow.
Yeah, and these Goths had turned up in the back of the church that he worked for, and he looked at the service going on, and he looked at these people. They basically come in because it was raining, and he thought this service isn't going to quite appeal to these people. So he took them over to the church hall, and they had a nice evening in the church hall. And then he said, you can have this church hall every Sunday evening, but it comes with one condition. And they said, what's that condition? He said, it comes with me. And he had this amazing, I mean, it was just extraordinary. He'd do a little Bible study with some of the team who were helping run the evening for the Goths, and the Goths started turning up to the Bible study.
Wow.
And then he'd say, well, we'll end the evening with Compline once the Goths had gone home. And then the Goths insisted on staying for Compline. And just this amazing ministry developed. But it comes out of that heart for inclusion.
Yes.
That says, I believe the church should be there for these people. And I think that's really crucial.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story. I was getting a bit teary when you were talking about it. Final question then. Do you have any words of encouragement, words of wisdom, advice for individuals who are exploring a vocation to ordain to ministry?
Yeah, give up. And I mean that, but I mean that in a slightly different way from the way that sounds. The most important bit of my journey of discernment was that prayer that I prayed that said, I will do whatever you want as long as I know what it is. For me, so much of ministry is about relinquishment anyway, but actually so much of discernment is about that relinquishment and trust, giving ourselves to God and trusting that God is on the job. You know, it's really interesting, you know, your parents saying, you know, how are you going to pay your bills? I've always had, and it came out of, it was something Jackie Pullinger said in that talk, actually. You know, she said that when people, you know, turn around sometimes and they say, but I'm married, you know, or I have children or something like that. And she said, well, don't you think that God knows that?
Yeah.
You know, he wouldn't call you to do something impossible.
Yes.
So you just have to trust that will be all right. And in all our moves, in all the things that we've done, you know, the children have been cared for, I think, in that process. My wife's been able to find work. You know, there's something about trusting God with the process,
yes,
but also about constantly relinquishing ourselves.
Yeah.
But back in my time in Coventry, once I'd kind of done my 5 years, I thought that my time there was done, but I didn't know what I was going to move on to do. And so it was a really interesting time where I was thinking, well, maybe we will move, you know, in this year, but I don't know what to or what. So as the clock struck midnight on January the 1st of, what was that, 2008, I sat down with my wife. We prayed prayers of relinquishment. We prayed the Methodist covenant prayer. You know, I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. We prayed the prayer of Charles de Foucault. You know, I abandon myself to you. You know, and then I remember at the time there wasn't anywhere suitable in the house to say morning prayer, so I had this kind of 6x4 prayer shed in the garden. And I remember sat in that prayer shed thinking, come on, you know, I've kind of passed the responsibility onto you now. You got to do something. And then I realized that relinquishment wasn't transactional like that. I was also giving up the demand upon God to actually do anything. And so I discovered over the months that followed a deeper and deeper engagement with the whole thing of relinquishment. And I remember my spiritual director at the time thought, you know, the wheels are going to fall off this wagon. This is going to be really, really difficult. And I probably thought that too. But actually what I realized is that as I kept giving myself to God, trusting in God, it just felt a lot more like love.
Yeah.
Is actually what it is.
Yeah.
And it was one of the richest times spiritually for me in my ministry, as day after day after day, I just basically stood before God and said, here I am. I give myself to you. And I think if we can keep doing that through any discernment process, God will guide us. He'll call us in the way that's right for us. And we have to trust that, you know, he knows what's good for us too, and it'll be all right.
Yeah. And even in my own journey, I have found, you know, trusting in God quite scary, but actually it's been quite liberating as well, for myself and those who I share life with. So Bishop, thank you so much for all that you shared. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your own vocational journey. And I'm sure that for those that will be watching this particular conversation, I'm sure that they'll be deeply encouraged. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And so until next time, bye.